the case that we can't afford not to, and that this is the kind of investment that makes our state not just a playground for the rich, right, but rather a playground for all of our kids, and that's really, really important.
You are hearing the voice of acclaimed author Heather McGhee, who wrote The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. She also just spoke to the Children's Alliance here in Seattle about how her work is connected with the world of education. How can we root out racism in the education system? Plus, how can we make our schools safer in a country torn apart by gun violence? And what are the challenges facing the expansion of our state's preschool system? We have a lot to consider here in another education-focused edition of Seattle News, Views, and Brews. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. I'm also host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are my own. And I'm joined once again by Dr. Stefan Blandford, Executive Director of the Children's Alliance, former Seattle School Board Director. He actually hosted this event with Heather McGhee, you heard a sampling of off the top of the show. And Stefan, I had a great time talking with you a couple of weeks ago, and I did want to have you back on the program to follow up on a number of topics. But first things first, I'm noticing your hair is looking only slightly singed. So it appears it didn't get completely on fire there. I'm guessing the work behind the scenes to pull off this virtual event, Voices for Children, was successful. How did it go?
It went really well. There's still a lot of work to do, as you would expect in a virtual event, but we're really pleased and so pleased with Heather's performance, what she had to say, how it resonated, how warm and personable she was, but she brought the science as well. She was pretty hard hitting in her analysis. It was perfect.
Yeah, a very smart and impressive person that you were able to bring on your program there. So thank you for breaking that down with me, and thank you for being with me once again, Stefan. Thanks also to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. Show them some love, other small businesses too. Thanks also to our show patrons. Everyone, please support local journalism if you can. It's Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. We also thank Converge Media. Converge airs the video version of our podcast on their YouTube channel Wednesday nights at 7. All right, off we go with right here, right now. Stefan, so last time we talked about the drained pool image that Heather McGhee discussed in her book, The Cost of Racism on People of All Colors, including white people. So during the 50s and 60s, some communities simply drained their public pools rather than integrate them, which created a cost for everyone. So in this presentation a couple of days ago here at the Voices for Children event for the Children's Alliance, what did you learn about this concept, this zero sum game idea? How does it intersect with public education? Are we still draining the pool? What do you got?
I think so. I think it's unfortunate, and particularly in Seattle, it's particularly unfortunate that that drain pool image still shows up in our public schools. There are lots of situations that I encountered as a school board director where I thought of the fact that we'd be better if we figured out a way to work together and to realize that we're all bound up in the challenges of serving all of our students. While I was on the school board, it was about 54,000 students. And so I thought about all of them and how we could make outcomes better for all of them. There are a lot of people that I encountered that were very much caught up in that notion of a zero sum, that they wanted to acquire as much as they could for their kids to the detriment of other kids. That's called opportunity hoarding.
Interesting. And I think we talked about this a little bit on the last program, but is it trying to make sure that certain schools get certain top programs or whatever else at the expense, potentially, if you look at it that way, of other schools? Was that part of this?
Yeah, I think it's born of a naivete that a school system is a fixed system that has a limited amount of resources. And so it's incumbent on all parents, and I don't fault parents for advocating for everything that they can get for their child.
Of course not.
But when you don't think about the fact that it's a fixed system, then in order for you to get more for your child, someone else has to give up something. And that's the piece that I don't think people are willing to actually grapple with, that opportunity hoarding, trying to get every advantage for your child frequently comes at the expense of other people's children.
I wanted to make sure you talked about, I want to dive into higher education if I could with you real quick on this, Stefan, because I know you talked about this with Heather. You sent a child off to college just last year. She has written quite a bit about higher education in her work. And I wanted to talk about that conversation because I think zero-sum thinking can impact those decisions too about college.
Yeah, she and I were talking, one Black person to another
Hmm.
about the challenges that we as Black folks have to make around having our kids exposed to different ways of thinking versus and taking the chance that they will lose something of themselves
Mm.
as Black people. And so I shared the story of at every level, from preschool all the way to my kid being in college now.
Hmm.
Her mom and I had to really grapple with what does it mean to put our kid in high quality experiences
Hmm.
in there, and usually very homogenous experiences where she would be
Right.
the outsider over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And that's something that families of color frequently have to grapple with, is
Hmm.
how much of one or the other are they going to allow their kids to experience.
Hmm. And what was your experience with that? I guess that was just difficult to grapple with, difficult for your child to grapple with too.
Yeah, ultimately we landed on the idea that having our kid in multicultural experiences, like I had when I was growing up.
Hmm.
I grew up on a military base, probably as diverse
Wow.
neighborhood as you can experience.
Yeah.
And we landed on trying to find opportunities for our kid to experience a wealth of diversity
Yeah.
in her friends and the relationships and the teachers that she was exposed to, but sometimes at the detriment of what would be considered the best quality educational experience. We define quality in a lot of different ways
Yeah.
than just the highest grade. In many cases, it's the ability to talk across race, to
Mm.
engage with people who are different than you. We found that was the most successful opportunity for her.
Got it. And just going down this path a little bit further, I think it's so interesting because Heather, in her book, talks about education programs like the GI Bill, for example,
Mhm.
which was put in place so that GIs coming back from World War II could get some money for education, for home
Right.
ownership, or whatever else. It ended up getting filtered through racial segregation
Yes,
too when
absolutely.
it was executed. And I think the point she's making, and help me out with this, if you can look at this in a larger sense, is that even when we have programs in place that are supposed to level the playing field or whatever else, there's still some very important due diligence that needs to
Right.
happen to make sure they're administered in an equitable way.
Yeah, administered is a good word. We at Children's Alliance spend a lot of time on the administration of policy, so the
Hmm.
implementation of
Right.
policy, because it can be voted on in a legislature or in Congress one way, and then actually be on the ground for children and families. It can show up in a very different way. And so
Mm.
part of our work is to ensure that the legislative intent of bills that are passed in the state legislature actually make sense. So what happened in the GI Bill situation is, in the administrative writing of that bill, they ended up actually figuring out a way to exclude Black and brown folks. My dad and my granddad served in the military, did not
Mm.
have exposure to the GI Bill,
Mm.
and there's a huge amount of wealth that is created as a result of access to higher education
Right.
that we did not experience
Mm.
as a result.
And I'm thinking about that because just I think there's a generational wealth. You think about dollars, but there's almost a generational educational wealth too,
Oh
if
yeah.
you will. And maybe I'm using the wrong phrase there, but it seems like that's something that goes from generation to generation as well. Educational opportunity.
Yeah, we call it, in the academic world, we call it social capital.
Mm.
And it
Right.
is the ability to have resources that are necessary as you're moving up the ladder of attainment and income over time. The ability to be able to reach out to someone that you met in college that helps you to get the first job, or some connections that you have in the business world that
Hmm.
allows you to get a house, or, to make the kind of connections that allow your family to create wealth that some in our community have, and others do not have at all. I know this from personal experience as someone who did not have a lot of social capital when I was growing up, and somehow very fortunately was able to develop it over time.
That it does take some time. And I think about that whole concept of education and wealth, because you got to be pretty wealthy to put someone through college these days. I know it, you know it. We're both putting kids through college right now. And I think about this. I'll date myself a little bit here. I was at the University of California at Berkeley, go Bears, from 89 to 93. And I recall when I started there, the cost per semester was $680. Now, which is ridiculous to think about right now. Now, over time, it went up to something like $4,000 by the time I was a senior, which is a huge jump if you think about that. But I think the other side to this, Stefan, and backstory on this also, University of California system used to be free for all California residents. It's incredible to think about that, but that's exactly what goes on. The investments that we make as a society into education have changed, and they changed that game such that it is laid on the student now to incur that debt, to put off decisions like marriage or owning a house or even retirement. It can affect down the line there as well. Can you talk about that part of the issue too? Because I think those rising costs are a big part of education in our country in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, it's so funny that you bring up the topic of how much your college cost when you were going through it. Now that we're paying almost $100,000 a year.
Wow.
Almost, for an elite university, when I know for sure that from the day I entered college to the day I left, there is no way that I spent $100,000 for all expenses. So I know what it's like to see that escalating cost. And it has a profound implication for who can go to college. I was walking across the University of Washington campus, go Huskies, proud graduate, the other day, and I was thinking about who can actually afford to go to that college. It's the flagship institution in Washington State, and it is becoming less and less diverse with people who, experience their K-12 experience in Washington State, partially because the costs are just escalating.
Wow. I just wanted to make sure we came back to your discussion with Heather McGee here, because I'd like to try to get to the point where we can try to dismantle some of these pieces of structural racism that happen in institutions like our education system here. I know that's a massive undertaking, but I know it's something you've been dedicated to in your career too. What did you learn about that piece from Heather with regard to what you can do as Children's Alliance, what the average person can do with this pretty monumental task?
Well, I think more than anything else, and we only had a little bit of time on the topic of education where we were talking about integration, which I hope we will get into.
Sure.
But I think her overall point was that we need to kind of interrogate our positionality in this conversation about race. I think she was speaking very eloquently to what we as individuals and we as leaders of institutions need to be thinking about. So there's the personal part, right? We are bathed in, we grow up in these narratives of stereotypes and oppression that we don't really recognize that we're in this river that's taking us in a place that we don't want to go. She asked us to think about that very deeply, and then to think about our role as leaders of institutions and what we do to create a different outcome so that we don't have these large disparities playing out over and over and over again. And I think she did that particularly well. Ultimately, in my mind, if we're not talking about our own positionality in this work, then it doesn't have very much resonance. It becomes performative. It's like putting a Black Lives Matter sign on your front lawn and calling it good, right? Instead of thinking about what is my privilege? What privilege do I bring? And how can I dismantle that and be sure that we're providing opportunities to all people, not based on the color of their skin, but as Martin Luther King said so eloquently, on the content of their character.
Right. And does this touch on that integration conversation you had with Heather?
Yeah, so I'm the executive director, I'm the board chair for Integrated Schools.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Which is the national organization that really interrogates white people's choices around where they enroll their kids in school.
Mm-hmm.
And Heather wrote a book. A chapter of her book is specifically talking about that challenge, which is the fact that since 1954, since the Brown v. Board of Education decision, we've become more segregated. We are more segregated in the United States right now than we were pre-Brown v. Board. And the fact that we are going in the reverse, we are resegregating our public schools, has long-term implications for the trajectory of our country. And so our organization is trying to tease out what is it that is making people not align their values around integration with the actions that they're taking. And I believe that there's a really serious conversation that needs to be held in the country around that topic.
One of many serious conversations around education. We're going to have one about public safety and public education, discussing the tragedy of the Uvalde, Texas school shooting and what our school systems can learn from it. We're going to break it down on Now Hear This. All right, let me switch over to here. 5, 4, 3, 2. Well, the shock of the tragedy in Uvalde, Texas is so hard to take. 19 kids killed, 2 teachers, and yet another mass shooting. It's part of an epidemic of gun violence that is occurring in our community, too. Here's what Mayor Bruce Harrell talked about on this subject back near the start of this year.
Shootings and shot-fired incidents increased 40% to an all-time high. Overall violent crime increased by 20%, reaching the highest level we've seen in 24 years.
Stefan, I want to talk about this with you because it's a story that, as much as I want to push it out of my head, it keeps coming back. Seattle schools had a series of shutdowns last November and December following a school shooting in Michigan where 4 students were killed. There was a social media post after that encouraged more people to commit acts of violence in our schools. And I think about the Texas shooting. In the wake of that, our state school superintendent, Chris Rakedahl, said, hey, we've got safety measures in place, but still, that doesn't mean another tragedy could not happen here. How do you react to this news about Uvalde, Stefan?
Well, my heart was just broken when I got the post that there was another school shooting, and then learned the details, and they continue to unfold and to get more and more dark. It's just heartbreaking. But I also think about, obviously the ready availability of guns in our society and how we need to address that issue. I am very troubled as someone who's an advocate for children. I'm very troubled by the indicators that we're seeing of kids in crisis. I saw a study, and then I verified it with superintendents on the east side of the state and on the west side of the state. They are saying the number one crisis that they have to deal with is not declining enrollment. It is the mental health of the students who are in the schools. And I think that played out in Uvalde. And it's playing out, there was one statistic that was shared recently that the number of kids that are getting suicide assessments in schools is equivalent to the number of kids that they saw over a 4-year period. Wow. They just got in the first 4 months of this school year. And that is a lingering, or that is a pretty severe crisis that we are not well equipped to deal with in Washington state and across the country. But we have to attend to that because there's the potential for a lot more of these disasters to happen.
And I'm just thinking about this because we saw a number of rallies and protests around the Seattle area with students walking out of classes after this shooting, a demand for a mental health council in every school building, a call for a ban on all semi-automatic weapons. Just to wrap up on this topic, it just gets me to thinking, what can people do? I always feel so powerless after events like this. Some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of good thoughts on that. I was listening to a story on the radio yesterday talking about the number of people who complete polls and say that they support some sort of gun control legislation, eliminating assault weapons. And then on the other hand, we can't get any progress in Congress on that issue. And I think we have to do some soul searching. I wonder how many children have to die before we actually take action. It is sad, and I hope for some solution that is better than what we have right now.
Fair enough. I want to switch gears with you and talk about another headline that's less shocking, but still brings with it some concern. I read in the Seattle Times recently that our state-funded public preschool program is suffering from a lack of available workers. So I understand it as this. Plenty of parents are interested in these programs, but you have places like the Denise Louie Education Center in Seattle down on the Chinatown ID. They don't have the personnel to open enough programs. I know that you work in the space, Stefan. What's going on?
Yeah, I worked in this, we work in this space, and my kid was actually enrolled in the Denise Louie Center in Chinatown. So as I was reading that story, I was reflecting on, could actually see the room that my kid grew up, who's starting college this year. So it is something that I think about a lot, and we at Children's Alliance work on quite a bit. It's there are several issues at play. The first being teachers are underpaid. And, we've talked before about the Fair Start for Kids Act, which is putting about $1 billion into the educational system, but did not address the fundamental issue of worker compensation. That is something that I'm on a committee that is working to develop a plan for that. And hopefully there'll be an infusion of money to bring salaries up so you can retain good teachers. There's an issue with background checks. We all support the idea of, we want to be sure that a worker who is a provider who is working with children has a background check, so we can ensure that they are safe and appropriate to work with kids. Right now, the state is so backed up in that someone who is recently hired by a child care center has to wait long enough where if they had another application out with Burger King, they may have to take the job with Burger King. We have been working to try to figure out what the solution is to that, but there's not an easy answer. And so that's the work of the Children's Alliance to try to push on those issues.
Got it. Because the concern there is, if fewer kids are enrolled in these types of programs, they miss some educational milestones they really need to hit before kindergarten, et cetera. Can you touch on that? Because that's the root of it all, is trying to make sure that these kids are provided for. And I know the pandemic had some impact on this too, but when there isn't room in these programs, or they're not able to offer these different courses or programs, I should say, because they don't have the teachers, that makes an impact on kids and families.
It has a huge impact. Before the pandemic, we were already struggling with this idea of summer melt, which is kids that are in school throughout the year, they have the summer off, and they show back up at school because they haven't had the reinforcement during the summertime. They lose a lot of educational gains that they got during the year. That is exacerbated to the nth degree by the idea that kids haven't been in school for long periods of time. And the result of that is a study I saw recently says that kids have lost 2 years of education. And the implications of that for Black and brown kids are profound. Many white kids their parents have been able to put them in other situations. They have access to technology. They have the ability to do online classes. So you're seeing an expansion of the opportunity gap as a result that is very concerning.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, talking about the impacts of the pandemic on our education system, a checkup on COVID, and see what the report card looks like on what's next. Well, Stefan, you were starting to go down this path, and I want to keep going here. The future of our educational system as we try to emerge from the COVID pandemic. I was reading a few studies on this too, and one of them shows that 2/3 of parents are worried their child is not on track in school. And I'm trying to figure out how these school systems recover, because I know that's a concern for you too. Some thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, in some ways, I have heard that kindergartners and juniors and seniors are the ones that are suffering the most, because kindergarten is such a crucial school academic year for kids. You're learning a lot of the basics around interacting with other kids, being able to sit, starting to learn reading. And none of that is happening as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And then, juniors and seniors who are struggling with culminating and moving on to the next stage of their lives,
Yeah.
whether it be college or career, they're not getting the reinforcements that they need. They're not getting the opportunities that they need. And so there's a crisis there, but at every point, 5th grade, 8th grade, 10th grade, all of those are really critical educational moments where if you don't have that reinforcement, then kids get off track and don't graduate, and then, suffer a lifetime of consequences as a result. And so we really have to double down. Part of the challenge for public schools is our enrollments are declining.
I was going to say, I think a lot of parents said, all right, wow, this looks like trouble. Let's put our kid in a private school, or let's homeschool them, or whatever else.
Right.
That's kind of part of this phenomenon.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you have to have a certain amount of social capital to be able to pull that off.
Yeah.
And so for those that don't have social capital, you see the gap only grow and have lifetime consequences for those children. And so it's something that I'm hoping that educational systems double down on what are the supports that are necessary, not only academically, but social, emotionally.
Yeah.
A lot of kids in crisis, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so we've got to address
mentioned
those issues too.
Thank you. You mentioned that earlier, and I think those behavioral issues are massive, and I feel like we're not seeing the full impact of them yet, if you will. I feel like this is something that's going to potentially have a continuing impact on these students. What can school systems do? We hear more about having more mental health advisors or counselors in different schools or whatever else. Is that the path, or I guess it needs to be integrated more into the classroom? Who knows, with the curriculum?
Yeah, I think it needs to be integrated more into classrooms, but we're struggling with the pipeline problem.
I see.
It is hard to get enough certified providers, right? Who can make more money outside of the educational system.
Right.
And so you can't throw money at this problem. It's got to be an integrated solution where you triage and find kids who are most in crisis and deal with or assign them to the limited number of providers that are out there while you try to rebuild the system. And so there are no easy solutions on this one. And I fear that things are going to get worse before they get better.
Well, I do know that you're an optimistic person, though, Stefan, and I want to make sure that I start wrapping up with you and ask this question here. As we wrap up the school year here and head to the next one in the fall here, what kind of outcomes are you hoping for, are you advocating for? Talk to me about that, please.
Well, personally, I think you, as a dad and as a former school board director, you have to be positive. You have to be optimistic that things are going to turn. And I believe that, the number of parents that I talk to who want to be part of the solution, the philanthropists that I get a chance to engage with, they want to be part of the solution. And I think shows like yours that really give us the opportunity to kind of dig down into the root causes and then to hopefully develop some solutions are the ones that add a lot of value. It's easy to criticize Seattle Public Schools or whatever school district for all the failings. And there are some, there's no doubt.
Right.
But I think taking a positive approach to that and how can I be solution oriented, it makes a lot more sense. And that's something at Children's Alliance we do all the time. Every day we put on our big boy pants and go into battle trying to figure out solutions and trying to make sure that those solutions come from the communities that are most impacted by the choices that we make.
Just to touch on that, what is the next battleground for you? Is there something specific the Alliance is focused on right now?
Well, I think we are needing to double down on the health crisis. And it is broad. We talked about mental health, but there's also access to health.
Sure.
Right. There's access to dental services. That's a really big deal. And I think we have to really kind of look at our educational systems and redesign them. The pandemic has given us the opportunity to look at education differently. It doesn't make sense to sit in a chair for 13 years in order to get a degree. For some kids, they can do it in 10.
Yeah.
right? For other kids, they need to do it in 14.
Yeah.
And so how can we think about that differently, particularly given the fact that content can flow far more easily than being stuck in a classroom, in a brick and mortar classroom?
Yeah.
And so there's lots of different innovations that if we think differently and we aren't wedded to the old way of doing things, which did not work for lots and lots of kids to start off with, we can be optimistic and innovative and come up with solutions that work for the majority of kids.
I can't wait to follow up with you on that one, Stefan. I thank you so much. Dr. Stefan Blanford, Executive Director of the Children's Alliance. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
It's always a treat to talk with you, Brian.
All right, great.
Back. I'll come back.
You got it. I know we will. All right. And folks, you can learn more about the Alliance at children'salliance.org. Thanks again to our patrons out there, everybody who's listening. It's Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics and education. Subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you might listen. Again, please do become a patron on Patreon if you like what you're hearing. We really could use the support. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media too. We'll see you soon. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.